So what do you want to talk about today?
Not sure.
Not sure? Okay. Well, I guess
Yeah.
I'll be the one to ask the questions. So, let's see. Last time we talked about a lot of different things. I remember one thing that came up near the end of our conversation was the concept of emergence.
Yeah.
As to where, certain constituents of a system will emerge into what would you say, like a higher level?
Well,
or a higher unity?
That's one way of putting it.
Okay.
Yeah.
How would you explain emergence?
A system can have certain traits due to the interaction of its constituent parts. That those constituent parts
have certain what? Certain fates?
Certain traits, certain features.
Traits.
That its constituent parts don't have, but arise due to the interaction of those parts.
So are these the whole purpose of the system, or are they more epiphenomenal? Like they just are a sort of happenstance of what the system is already doing?
It can be either.
Either or, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the most general way to describe it, I think.
So would you say emergence just explains to some degree the phenomenon of consciousness?
Consciousness is a tricky one because
Okay.
it's difficult to define.
I guess just the awareness of yourself.
Yeah. I think that could be an emergent property of the interactions between cells in the brain.
Okay, yeah, so there's the system of brain cells,
Yeah.
and consciousness sort of emerges out of that, or self-awareness, something like that.
Yeah.
Is that an epiphenomenon, or would that be a sort of... I mean, asking the purposeful question is always dubious because it opens up a lot of cans of worms, I guess. But, is that what the system is trying to do, is to create that emergence of consciousness, or is it just sort of happenstance?
That's more of that's a matter of
or maybe it's just selected
perspective,
for
of framing. Yeah.
evolutionarily or something.
I mean, I think that's how the brain developed the way it has. It was selected for evolutionarily.
Yeah.
Large brains mean that we can be very clever in the ways we survive.
Okay. So because of that, because in that way, our perception is formed via evolutionary processes that are dictated, like you said, based on our ability to survive and survive effectively.
Yeah.
And in tandem with something like sexual selection. So if that's the case, does that make our perception sort of dependent on those forces and therefore subject to them, in which we can't really trust our perception in any ultimate sense because the only information it's giving us is based on survival, and so it might not be giving us all of the information about the world around us, just the things that are based on survival?
To an extent, yes.
Okay.
Now, natural selection just doesn't necessarily ensure that you are maximally equipped to survive. There is sort of a random element to the processes of evolution.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are a lot of cognitive biases that can be studied. A lot of limitations to the way we perceive things that are tied to evolution.
Okay. So there's limitations in our perception because of the kind of forces in which our perception has come about.
Yeah.
Something like that. So, but emergence is that phenomenon of consciousness that is emerging from those constituent elements of the cells and such.
Yeah.
So, okay, so now that we have that sort of picture, some might say, this is an argument I've heard before, that this concept of emergence is sort of like hand wave at what might otherwise be considered a certain kind of miracle, where it just kind of happens, and there's no exact reason why something might jump from the constituents to this higher level of thing, but it seems to occur, and so it's just called emergence. Do you think there is like a mechanistic, causal kind of analysis that we could do to really map this thing out, or is it sort of always going to be this hand wavy thing?
I don't think it's always going to be this hand wavy thing. When emergence is brought up, I think it's usually done so to point out the fallacy of thinking that cells can't think, therefore there's no reason the brain should be able to think. But the exact science of how that happens is still developing.
Okay, so you're optimistic that we will find a more exact way of analyzing that process of emergence.
In the case of the human brain, I'm not certain that we'll ever come to come to an exact analysis, but we can get closer and closer to one.
And maybe emergence that might be found in different
different systems. I mean, there are simple examples you could give for that. Like, a water molecule isn't wet, but a puddle of water is wet, for example.
Okay. And do you think that water molecule is the primary constituent, or can it, like, obviously there's other entities, I suppose, or constituents of the molecule itself.
Yeah.
So why do we select that level of analysis of the molecule rather than, let's say, the quark, or maybe even something deeper than that?
Well, it just depends on the context that we're talking about.
So in that sense, is there this sort of infinite, like, I don't want to say, is there this sort of infinite way of going down the, let's say, hierarchy of constituents? Like, there's an inexhaustible kind of depth to how low we could go with our level of analysis, like the molecule, the quark, the,
whatever's below that,
and then just keep on going. Like, is there any end to that?
I don't know, honestly. Okay. That's a very deep cosmological question.
Okay.
There is at least a point at which we will never know what is going on at this small a scale.
Yeah.
But we can't really know if something is actually going on.
Okay, sure.
But we can try our best to come up with an approximation of it that we can work with.
Okay. So we come up with approximations that take their form in some sort of modeling or some theory.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's fair, and we just do our best. To model them the best we can. So to bring this back to the human brain, because it's such a fascinating topic.
Yeah.
I've listened here and there to this neuroscientist named Ian McGilchrist. Have you ever heard of him?
Don't think so.
Okay, and I want to bring up some of his work because I think it raises some interesting questions. So his research is primarily to do with the left and the right hemispheres of the brain, and kind of why they've formed that way, what purposes they serve in a sort of even cosmological sense, like why do we see the world the way we do, or interact with the world the way we do, based on these things.
Yeah.
And so his whole idea is that because the right brain seems to be more focused on the whole picture in this sort of flowy, real reality outside of us, and the left hemisphere has more to do with like creating models that abstract the world and creating maps that we can use to simplify the world. So those are those two forces that are kind of pulling and pushing on each other. And he's saying, okay, emergence is actually is actually like less of the phenomenon and can be better understood as like a top-down process that feeds from the whole picture that we have access to. Like rather than a sort of bottom-up emergence. Like how do you are you open to the idea of a more top-down process rather than a bottom-up emergence?
Well, I'm not entirely sure what that would mean.
So in his case, in particular, it means something like a whole picture sort of exposure that you have with the right hemisphere of the brain.
Yeah.
That gives you this real relationship with the world that doesn't really have any like constituent parts.
Yeah.
And then as you like model that, then you sort of see constituent parts. So it's like the opposite of emergence.
That sounds more like a pretty good description of like how most people think.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's just I'm not sure that's talking about the same kind of emergence I was a few minutes ago.
Oh yeah, well it's not emergence. It's in some sense it would be like the opposite of emergence.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm just asking like what your take is on that sort of concept, if that's even like conceptually possible in your worldview.
Well, I don't think it makes all that much sense to like model things that way or do scientific investigation that way, because the big picture can be a very vague thing, very hard to do reasoning upon until you break it down into those constituent parts.
So you really just don't see it as like a workable model to do science, which is fair to a certain degree, because science is a computational tool that uses models. I was more just talking about it as a theory of consciousness.
I can sort of see it.
Okay.
And like I said, consciousness is something that I don't really have a firm belief about.
Yeah.
Because I think you can explain some aspects of it, some definitions of it. I think there will be some extent to which those explanations are always unsatisfying. So, like, that sort of top-down view might provide a more satisfying explanation, although it's also more satisfying in part because of its open vagueness.
Okay, yeah. It's so, in a sense, it's like a cheap answer, in your opinion, because it doesn't do the work of looking at the actual mechanisms.
Yeah, it's a cheap answer, but I don't think there are really non-cheap answers to the harder problem of consciousness.
Okay, fair enough. But yeah, so you see some, it's not completely unthinkable, but it's also not any better than anything else you've come across.
Yeah.
Okay, something like that.
Pretty much.
Okay. Fair enough. I actually just wanted to... I was thinking about our conversation previously, and I had listened to that sort of concept afterwards, and I wanted to bring that up to you.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah. That kind of whole picture down as opposed to constituents up. It's very interesting. Perceptual and up, like perceptual
shift, I guess.
That's what I meant to say. Yeah. So, let's see. So we should probably keep on this same vein, because I think it's best with these sort of videos to try to keep it condensed, so I actually have something to title them, so we can actually talk about similar things. So as far as, I think I started this conversation talking about emergence, so we don't have to continue in that. I think we've kind of exhausted that in particular. But I guess like do you think like how do you explain the consistency of the patterns of your existence if there is this sort of arbitrarity or this sort of chaotic source? Like how do you explain like how you might, for example, this is kind of a silly example, but I've used it a few times, where you buy a gallon of milk from the store, you go home and you put it in your fridge, and then when you wake up, the next morning your room is the same, your fridge looks the same, the gallon of milk you remember putting there is still there. And so, like, why are there these consistencies if the world has this sort of arbitrarity that's intrinsic about it?
Well, I don't think there's any more reason for the world to be chaotic by default than there is for it to be structured by default. And an underlying chaos under certain parameters can also create a certain orderly structure. But yeah, I'm not really sure how to answer that question.
An underlying chaos can have a semblance of order? Is that kind of what you mean?
Well, it can create an emergent order, to go back to that. If it's under certain parameters, you know.
Okay, so
under certain conditions.
Why are those conditions there though? If it's sort of and there's this underlying chaos, like why do we even get those constraints?
Well, I mean, I don't know. But also, like I said, I don't think there's a reason to assume that the world should be chaotic in the absence of other factors, any more than it should have the structure that it does. Arbitrary doesn't necessarily mean random by default.
Yeah. I'm gonna make sure the camera's still working.
All right.
Still running. So random doesn't mean arbitrary by default. Is that what you said?
Vice versa. I said if the rules of the universe, let's say, are arbitrary, that doesn't mean that they are by default random.
Okay.
You know?
Okay. So
that randomness is the order. You know.
Okay, but is there something that is underlyingly, in some sense, random about those conditions?
Yeah. I don't know.
You don't know. Yeah, fair enough. Okay. So, just because the rules are arbitrary doesn't mean...
Yeah, I mean, you can make an arbitrary choice of an orderly set of rules.
Yeah, like you can get a bunch of pieces together and create like a 9x9 set of squares, sort of like chess, but bigger maybe, and assign them certain rules based on a particular whim.
Are you familiar with cellular automatons like Conway's Game of Life?
I've heard of it, yeah.
Yeah, that's more what I'm thinking of. Like, you would not think it has a basic set of rules. I forget exactly what they are, but they're based on like it's a grid of pixels.
Yeah.
You have a set of initial pixels that can be randomly generated.
Yeah.
And they appear and disappear based on like the number of pixels adjacent to each square that are on. And from the very simple description, you wouldn't think it would produce any interesting behavior, but people have been inventing entire computers in it, proving that it's not only Turing complete, but that it is impossible to create a general algorithm for predicting its conditions 1,000 steps in. It
recreates some sort of chaos theory.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's
the sort of thing I'm thinking of.
Okay, well that's pretty interesting. But would you say to lay any of these constraints down, even if you just need a couple in order to create these complex, intricate systems, does like laying any of these constraints down, like, is it dependent on some sort of intelligence that
I don't
like in order for that system that you're talking about, the pixel system, to be created, didn't the intelligence of the person have to program the computer to have those constraints?
Well, John Conway came out with Conway's Game of Life.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's any evidence, because I think the mark of an intelligent creator of something is when it like clearly shows a purpose, a direction, and it is like holistically designed towards that purpose. There might be linguistic markers as well. I think the universe could either arbitrarily or just by logical necessity come upon a set of laws, let's say, with sufficient complexity to create, or sufficient emergent complexity to create what we see. I don't think that necessarily requires a creator.
Oh yeah, and you definitely brought that question to its sort of end in that, like, asking if the universe itself has to have a intelligence that is behind it. Sure. I guess it's just hard for me to see where information comes from if it doesn't come from some kind of intelligence. Like, for example, like an AI, like, it ultimately just takes the intelligence of human beings and, like, organizes it in a particular way. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, think about it this way. Everything we know about the universe comes from our own intelligence analyzing it.
Yeah.
All of that information exists in the context of our own minds. I don't think that because we can analyze it, it was information before we analyzed it.
Okay. So, you don't think because we can analyze it, it's like intrinsically informative?
Or it's intrinsically, like, intentionally created
for us
as information, you know?
Yeah, so in some sense, there's this external world outside of us that doesn't really care about us.
Yeah.
And we perceive it with the sort of perceptual systems that we've been formed having in a particular way based on those particular formations. And that relationship is not purposeful, but it just is a sort of happenstance.
Yeah, well, it just sort of is, I would say.
It just sort of is. Yeah. So that means that the world outside of us, our perception of the world that appears to be outside of us, is ultimately inaccessible in its true form because it's almost contaminated by our human perceptions that can't see the whole of it.
I wouldn't say contaminated, but we are accessing it through a specific and imperfect, you could say, user interface.
Okay. And is the reason why, like, me and you can both agree that this is a microphone, is that just because we've been formed biologically similarly enough to where we can do that? Or, like, we have similar enough faculties?
That's part of it, yeah. I mean, we have similar faculties, but I think even, like, we could talk about the hypothetical of communicating with an alien. We could probably communicate to an alien that this is a microphone, but we would have to
But why would they even have the
do
same
so in a very, very different way. They wouldn't have the same exact faculties, but they would have the same world. They just have a completely different way of processing it.
Okay. So if that's the case, I kind of want to draw this out into what I see as its sort of end. In that, like, reality is ultimately this sort of field of information. Maybe not even information, because you said that it's not intrinsically informative, but this field of sort of potential almost.
Yeah.
And that an entropy fighting being such as ourselves, or such as some alien, sees this sort of field of potential that has no particular form, and we give it form based on our perception. Something like that.
You could put it that way, but I think that the implications would depend on, like, the interpretation of that could be right or wrong, you know.
Okay, how is that? Like, how could you interpret that right or wrong?
Well, I think that the world, under the presumption that we both exist, I think the world exists before we do. It just
But does it exist in the way that we see it, or
It-
does it exist in sort of this field of just potential that has no form or substance?
Hey, I don't think
Um,
you're recording. You got your
Oh.
battery warning light on.
Did
Oh.
did it stop the recording?
Yeah.
No, I think it's still recording. But I should definitely charge it.
Need to charge up that portable battery.
Yeah. Okay. So go on.
Well, so I think the form that we give it through our perceptions it's based on something real, but it is not necessarily exactly correspondent to the underlying reality.
So there's something about the reality that we see that has some semblance of what it actually looks like,
yeah,
but it's sort of this like very vague semblance or very vague approximation.
yeah. Well, like everything that we can know about the world, like it's derived from something real in the world. The way we perceive it is not necessarily the only way to perceive it.
So okay, it's not the only way, but it's like one valid way. Like we're seeing something.
Yeah, we're seeing something that is real.
Okay, so it's not just this like field of potential without any substance until we exist to give it substance or to give it form. But
Yes.
there's some form that we encounter
Yeah.
that is real before we had encountered it. Something like
Yeah.
that. And what is that form? Like, what is that? Is there any way to conceptualize that other than just like waving your hands at the idea of it? Like, how much of
don't-
what we see is real and how much of it is just based on flawed human perception?
I don't know if you can really make a percentage
Okay.
deal of it. You can make all sorts of like
Yeah.
metaphors, you know. Like
Okay.
we are seeing maybe a photograph or a painting of the world, or we are seeing a
Yeah.
diagram, whereas the world is the actual phenomenon it's describing. you know.
Okay. So here's some sort of history of philosophy that I think is relevant. So, and this is from a particular perspective, of course, as with everything. But let's look at like back in history. We got Immanuel Kant. You've probably heard of him.
Yeah.
And he did a lot of different things. I mean, he focused a lot into morality, this sort of categorical imperative idea. We don't have to talk about that, but he had this sort of idea of each human being existing sort of apart from one another,
Yeah.
and there was this sort of atomization. We each had a relationship with what he would call God.
Yeah.
But other than that, the relationships that we have with one another are sort of vague illusions. And I might be misconstruing a few things. But then there was this sort of overcompensation, like, oh, that sounds horrible. I don't want to be in an atomized world where I don't even know if I'm seeing the other person in front of me correctly. So now, like something like Hegel would say, okay, well, we're actually all one being. And there's an illusion of difference. And so that like now all of a sudden it's like, okay, we're so interconnected, it's so beautiful. But now all of a sudden it's like, okay, wait, well, how am I separate? Where do I draw the borders? What
Yeah.
is this one thing? So how do we understand this balance between these two philosophical trains? Or would you just
So,
go on a third
I
track?
think we kind of got into similar territory with our first conversation.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it comes to, a lot of it is very subjective or relative in that you could draw the line in various places, but there are different places where it's more useful to draw that line.
Yeah.
So like, you could call the two of us a podcast together, you know? And that would be a reasonable thing to describe. There are certain features about the system of the two of us.
Yes.
But a more useful analysis in some contexts might come from thinking of us as separate individuals. So I think to some extent everything is... There's one perspective where everything is this one universe, and there's one perspective where there are only elementary particles interacting. But I think you have to just, depending on the context, come up with these abstractions of the systems as larger objects.
Okay.
That are to some extent separate from each other.
Okay, so basically try to meet somewhere in the middle?
Basically. Yeah.
Okay.
Like, keep in mind that there is no, like, fully objective way to separate everything perfectly, but you still need to think about separate parts in some contexts.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's no way to separate anything completely,
Yeah.
but we need the functional illusion of separation, or at least the acceptance of separation in order to do anything.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, okay. Would you subscribe to that sort of offhand like illusion comment? Like, is there only the illusion of separation that we need to be like functional individuals, or are things like actually separated in some sense?
I would mostly agree with the illusion framing.
Okay.
With the caveat that, you can't usefully think about the universe as one big thing.
Yeah.
It is a complicated system. It has various properties, various structures within it that you have to think of as the interaction of various parts.
Yeah.
That you can maybe never define perfectly, but certainly attempt to define.
But ultimately, it's just sort of one big thing.
I guess.
I guess, yeah. Yeah.
It's
hard to
it's
say.
kind of hard to like come up with a unifying theory.
Yeah. Would you say, because there's this Hegel? Do you know Hegel?
I know the name, and I
yeah.
know about dialectics.
Yeah. So there's this Hegelian idea. He believes, like I said before, that everything is one substance, and that history draws itself out in this sort of self-actualizing sense, where like this substance, through this illusion of separation, there's a synthesis, and through history, this one thing is becoming more self-actualized. What do you think about that idea? I
don't think history is a linear progression towards greater self-actualization. Is the thing. I think history is just, it's more of a detached description of the interactions within the universe.
Okay. Yeah. So it's a sort of detached description. Is it also like based on memory in some arbitrary sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's how we come up with those descriptions.
Okay. Yeah. So is it inextricably human? Because we build our history based on human life and not based on anything else?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the way we view history is certainly inextricably human. We don't consider the first 13.7 billion years of the universe more important than the last 100. Or most people don't.
Is there a good reason for that? Or do you think we should try to live in a sort of more detached way?
The reason for that is because human needs, human values and priorities are like entirely separate from the nature of the universe, or they arise as a result of humans and human societies rather than the laws of physics.
And is there something real about those things, or
Well, I think they're as real as any sort of description we can make of a separated object like this chair. You can't like perfectly define it, but it is like a valid description of the universe. And I think it's important. The way we do history
yeah?
is important because of its applicability to specifically human needs.
Yeah. And that's okay, or do you think it should be shifted?
I don't think we need to align our values exactly with the scale of the universe. That's a bit absurd. I think we need to maybe be aware of the way things really are.
Okay.
But ultimately, what matters in terms of our actions is the interactions between humans.
And why does that matter?
Well,
Is it just because it affects experiences?
I guess so. I find that I can't ignore what matters to my own experience.
Yeah.
And I think I draw from that I shouldn't ignore what matters to other people's experiences either. That's my most nebulous baseline basis for ethics, I think.
Okay. And is that just sort of like a bootstrapping?
That's sort of a bootstrap. I think you can take that in the direction of like various different ethical theories that try to analyze exactly what form our needs take.
But you wouldn't say there's any clear reason for why you should attend to those things, but you just feel like it's just like most important in a unexplainable way.
I guess so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, that my brain is about fried.
Yeah, and I need to go to my class.
Sounds good.